Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
The funny thing about being the one everyone relies on is that over time, people stop seeing you entirely. They come to expect your support the way they expect running water or a charged phone battery, necessary, dependable, invisible. And no one stops to ask how long you can hold up the weight of their needs before something inside you cracks. For years, I played that role without complaint, without recognition, and certainly without a contract. I did it because it felt like the right thing, the adult thing, the family thing, even when that family treated me more like a financial plan than a person. And while I never saw myself as someone who needed the spotlight or owed myself a thank you parade, there comes a point when the burden stops being a favor and becomes a form of slow, polite self-destruction, the kind that sneaks up on you not with a bang, but with silence and subtlety, like a leak you ignore until the ceiling caves in. My name's Lisa Madden, and if you had asked anyone in my family, up until last December, who I was, they'd probably tell you I was the stable one, the reliable older sister who always showed up, always paid on time, and never made a scene. They'd say I was quiet, maybe a little withdrawn since the divorce, maybe too wrapped up in my own world, but ultimately harmless, the kind of woman you didn't worry about because she didn't cause problems. What they wouldn't say, and what none of them seemed to realize, was that I was the reason the wheels kept turning behind the scenes. That for nearly 10 years, I had been quietly transferring money every month to cover tuition for Dan's 2 kids at that fancy private school in Columbus, the one with the uniforms and Latin motto and tuition that could buy you a decent used car each semester. They wouldn't mention how many times I covered their mortgage just this once, when Dan was between jobs, or Tina had a surprise medical bill, or how I sent birthday checks and Target gift cards and emergency Amazon orders when they needed diapers, formula, or new shoes. They wouldn't talk about how many of those emergencies were followed by beach photos on Instagram, or how the boat Dan posted a picture of 2 summers ago with the caption, "Dreams do come true," was actually bought with a loan he begged me for under the pretense of avoiding foreclosure. And through all of that, through the overdraft protections and the transfers and the tax write-offs I never took because it wasn't worth the paperwork, I kept my mouth shut because I believed that's what family did. You held each other up, you didn't keep score, you supported the kids because they didn't ask to be born into financial chaos. You helped because you could, and because not helping felt worse. It wasn't about being a martyr. It was about not letting your brother drown just because he was too proud or too foolish to ask for help in a way that didn't sound like a demand. I believed in grace, in giving without strings. I believed that love could look like quiet deposits and unspoken forgiveness. But what I didn't realize, what I refused to let myself see, was that there's a difference between being generous and being used. And once someone learns they can take from you without thanks or consequence, the taking never stops. It just becomes expected. That Christmas, we were all gathered at Mom's house like we had been every year since Dad passed, sitting around a table that creaked under the weight of casseroles and roasts and pies that none of us particularly liked, but made out of habit, the kind of gathering where everything looks like tradition on the surface and feels like resentment underneath. Dan was in rare form that night, riding high off some sales bonus or new title he'd just bragged about, laughing too loud, pouring too much wine, telling stories about himself with the kind of theatrical flair that had always drawn attention even when it wasn't earned. Tina sat beside him, polished and smiling, nodding in all the right places, dressed in something just expensive enough to signal stability, but casual enough to feign humility. Their kids were running around with new iPads, gifts from Santa, that I knew for a fact had been bought with the last of a November transfer. Everyone else seemed content to pretend things were normal. And then, in the middle of passing the mashed potatoes, Dan looked over at me with that smirk he'd been wearing since he was 15. The one that said he knew something you didn't, and said loud enough for the table to hear, "So, Lisa, what's it like being unemployed and single at Christmas? Must be cozy on that end of the table. No seat for failures up here." And he laughed. God, he laughed like it was the best joke in the world, and everyone else chuckled with that awkward politeness people use when they don't want to choose a side. My mother tensed but said nothing. Tina looked away. The kids didn't even pause their games. I smiled. I didn't flinch. I didn't say a word. I just picked up my phone under the table, opened my banking app, and canceled every automatic transfer scheduled for his household. Tuition, gone. Weekly deposit to Tina's account, gone. That little emergency buffer I had set up for when things unexpectedly came up, canceled. Every quiet act of generosity that had kept their lives stitched together without fraying. All of it erased with 3 swipes of my finger. Then I put my phone back down, took a bite of stuffing, and raised my glass. Nobody noticed. Not yet. They were still laughing, still talking, still playing their roles in a performance they thought I'd never walk away from. But something shifted inside me that night. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I realized I had mistaken my silence for strength, when in truth, silence had been my submission. And in that moment, in that room, filled with people who thought they knew who I was and what I'd tolerate, I decided that maybe being seen as a failure wasn't such a bad thing, if it meant I finally got to stop being invisible. There's a unique kind of silence that follows a decision no one sees coming. Not the silence of peace or reflection, but the brittle, high-pitched quiet that comes before glass shatters, before someone screams, before the first domino falls, and everyone finally notices that something in the room isn't right anymore, even if they can't name it. That was the kind of silence I woke up to the morning after Christmas, the air in my small house oddly still, my phone resting on the bedside table like a loaded weapon, a thing that had once simply brought calendar reminders. And news updates now pulsing with unread texts, missed calls, and brewing panic I didn't have to read to understand. I knew the moment my thumb touched the screen that the calm I had manufactured for myself the night before was already beginning to collapse under the weight of other people's expectations. And I also knew, with something close to grim satisfaction, that I wasn't going to lift a finger to stop it. The first message was from Tina, written in her usual soft panic style, an overuse of ellipses and emojis that tried to mask the urgency beneath something more palatable, asking, in a tone that teetered between confusion and accusation, if I had maybe forgotten to send the tuition payment, because the school had emailed her about a declined transaction, and she just wanted to check before she called them in a total panic. There was no hope you're well or thank you for all you've done, just that veiled, manic energy people get when the rug they're standing on starts slipping and they realize the floor beneath them was never solid to begin with. I didn't respond. I didn't owe her a confirmation or an explanation. I owed myself the decency of not playing the help desk role for people who had decided I was nothing more than an invisible source of stability. By the time I'd poured my coffee and opened the living room blinds, Dan had called twice, his name flashing on my screen like a warning flare, and I ignored both, letting them ring out into nothing because some silences are more powerful than words. And I wanted him to feel the absence of my compliance in a way he never had before. The third call, however, came with a voicemail, and curiosity mixed with that old foolish sense of duty that hadn't quite died in me yet, nudged me into listening. His voice, loud and frantic, was stripped of its usual charm, devoid of the arrogance that had fueled his Christmas table taunt. He sounded less like a man in control, and more like someone who had stepped into a room expecting applause and found it empty. "Lisa," he barked, barely pausing between words. "I don't know what the hell you're doing or why you'd pull something like this without a heads up, but you need to call me back right now. This is not okay. The school is threatening to pull the boys out if we don't make a payment by Monday. I've got Tina crying, I've got the kids asking questions, and I'm not about to explain to them that their aunt just ghosted the family like some damn psychopath. You're punishing the wrong people. Call me back. Today." I listened to it twice, not because I needed clarification, but because something about his tone, about the shift from condescension to desperation, was satisfying in a way I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't a man apologizing. This was a man flailing, trying to regain control of a narrative he had assumed was his to write. And more than that, this was a man who was just beginning to understand how deep my silence went, how long I had been holding the threads of his life in my hands, and what it meant now that I had finally chosen to let go. By noon, he was on my doorstep. I watched him through the peephole for a full minute before opening the door, standing barefoot in my hallway with a mug of tea and an expression I had practiced in the mirror. Not cruel, not angry, just still, like a woman who has finally run out of space to carry other people's chaos. He didn't knock. He just stood there, pacing a little, phone still in hand, mouth twitching like he couldn't decide whether to yell or beg. When I opened the door, he started talking immediately. No greeting, no pause. "What the hell is going on with you?" he snapped. "You think this is funny? You think this is some twisted lesson? Pulling money without warning? Do you even understand the position you've put me in?" I didn't answer. I just stared at him, waiting for the apology I knew wasn't coming, the recognition that never seemed to surface with Dan. Instead, he kept going, faster now, more animated, pointing his phone at me as if the screen held evidence of my betrayal. "Do you want the boys kicked out of school? Do you want Tina to think we're unstable? Because congratulations, that's exactly what you've done. You've made this whole family look like fools, and for what? Because I made a joke? Grow up, Lisa." It was the way he said it, a joke, that made something in me twist, because it reminded me how many times that word had been used as a shield by men like Dan, men who delivered cruelty in the form of punchlines, who laughed while they belittled you and then scolded you for not taking it well. It wasn't a joke. It was a truth wrapped in a smirk, and he knew it. "I'm done, Dan," I said finally, my voice low, steady, not shaking like I thought it might. "I'm done funding a life that treats me like an afterthought. I'm done pretending this is mutual. I'm done covering for you." His face changed then, not to remorse, but to something closer to panic masked with indignation. "You can't just walk away," he snapped. "You don't get to pull support and pretend like you didn't build half this system. You helped. You gave. Now own it." "I did," I said simply. "And now I've stopped." For a moment he just stared, mouth half open, breathing hard, like he was trying to summon the right words, trying to remember how to manipulate the situation back to his favor. But he didn't find them. Instead, he turned, muttered something under his breath I couldn't make out, and kicked the planter by my front step, the one Grandma used to keep her tulips in, shattering it in a spray of clay and dirt before storming back to his car. I didn't chase him. I didn't yell. I didn't text later to smooth things over. Instead, I picked up the broken pieces and threw them in the trash. Not because I was angry, but because I was tired of keeping anything fragile that could be destroyed by someone else's temper. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't his meltdown. It was mine, finally ending. There is an unspoken rule in families like mine, the kind held together more by a shared history than mutual respect, that no matter what happens, no matter how many lines are crossed or how many insults are cloaked in laughter, you do not disrupt the hierarchy, you do not break the illusion, and above all, you do not make people uncomfortable with truth. That rule, often presented as tradition or loyalty, has kept generations of people sitting quietly at holiday dinners, biting their tongues while resentment simmers just beneath the surface, all because admitting what's really happening would mean dismantling the story the family tells about itself. And I had broken that rule. No, I had obliterated it. With the swipe of a finger and a refusal to keep financing someone else's comfortable delusion. What I hadn't expected, or maybe had underestimated, was how quickly the rest of the family would turn on me, not out of personal betrayal, but out of the sheer inconvenience of being asked to look at something they'd all agreed never to see. The backlash came in waves, subtle at first, like distant thunder before the rain starts. A text from our mother, passive-aggressive in its wording and steeped in that cold Midwestern civility she wielded like a blade, read, "I heard there's been some tension with your brother. I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. Call me." That message was not an invitation to explain, but a command to smooth things over before she had to explain anything to her bridge club or church group, both of which were stocked with women who gossiped under the guise of prayer. I didn't respond. A day later, she followed up with a voicemail, less polite. Lisa, the situation has gone far enough. It's the holidays. I don't know what's going on between you and Dan. But you need to fix it. This family has been through enough. The way she said fix it, as if I'd broken something that was functioning just fine, told me everything I needed to know about where her allegiance lay. Not with fairness or truth, but with the appearance of harmony, no matter how false. Then came Aunt Shirley, our father's younger sister, who'd always fancied herself the emotional compass of the family, despite having spent most of her life hopping between manipulative relationships and MLM schemes. She sent a carefully worded Facebook message, full of spiritual overtones and judgmental sweetness, quoting scripture about forgiveness and reminding me that bitterness poisons the well for everyone. I didn't have the energy to explain that withholding money wasn't bitterness, it was boundaries. And that if she wanted to see poison, she should take a closer look at Dan's entitlement. Instead, I left the message unread, a digital monument to the fact that, for once in my life, I wasn't going to engage in the emotional labor of defending my right to stop bleeding for people who only saw me as useful when I was quiet and compliant. But the hardest message, the one that took me the longest to open, came from my oldest nephew, Jeremy, a boy I had practically helped raise when Tina was recovering from postpartum depression and Dan was too stressed at work to change diapers or warm bottles. Jeremy, who I had taken to soccer practices and helped with homework, who I had comforted during fevers and growing pains and those endless middle school friendship dramas, sent me a message late at night that simply read, "Mom's been crying all day. Why are you doing this to us?" It wasn't cruel, it wasn't manipulative. It was just a question from a child who had only ever seen me as a source of comfort and support. And in that moment, I felt the full weight of my choice settle onto my shoulders like bricks. Not because I regretted it, but because I realized that even when you make the right decision, it can still hurt like hell. I sat with that message for over an hour, fingers hovering over the keyboard, trying to decide if I should respond with honesty or kindness, or both. If there was even a way to explain to a 16-year-old that love doesn't mean enabling dysfunction, that supporting a family shouldn't come at the cost of your own self-worth, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stop pretending. In the end, I typed, "I love you, and I always will. But sometimes adults have to make choices that are hard to understand in the moment. One day, I hope you'll see that I didn't walk away from you. I walked away from being used." And then I cried, not because I doubted myself, but because love, when it's real, never comes without pain. The next morning, I drove to my lawyer's office, a modest brick building nestled between a dental clinic and a shuttered dry cleaner, the kind of place that didn't announce itself with glass towers or marble lobbies, but with quiet efficiency and practical lighting. I met with Darlene Becker, the same no-nonsense woman who had handled my divorce with more grace than my marriage had ever offered, and asked her to update my estate plan. I removed Dan as my emergency contact. I took Tina's name off the list of people to be notified in case of hospitalization. I rewrote the section about guardianship and revised the beneficiaries on my modest investment accounts. When she asked me, carefully and without judgment, if I was certain, I said yes. Not with bitterness, not with revenge in mind, but with the clear, cold understanding that I was finally choosing to live for myself, rather than continue operating as a safety net for people who never once asked how I was doing before asking for more. And that clarity didn't bring joy, not in the triumphant way movies like to portray. It didn't bring peace, at least not immediately. It brought space to feel everything I had been stuffing down for years. Space to look at the relationships I had been preserving out of obligation and realize they were more transactional than tender, more about expectation than affection. It brought room to breathe, room to mourn, room to rebuild something that wasn't constantly under siege by demands disguised as love. Back at home, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, rereading the last text from my mother, who had finally stopped asking for explanations and had instead sent a simple line. "This family is falling apart because of you." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because the truth, the one they were all scrambling to avoid, was that the family hadn't been held together by love or respect or shared values. It had been held together by me, by my money, by my silence, by my willingness to swallow every slight and shoulder every burden so that everyone else could keep pretending. And now that I had stopped, they were finally seeing how much they depended on someone they never even thanked. The loyalty they demanded had never been mutual, and every accusation they now threw at me only confirmed what I had feared for years, but never said out loud. In this family, love had always come with a price tag, and I had finally stopped paying. It's remarkable, in the most bitter and quietly humiliating sense of the word, how often people assume the ones who give the most are the ones who know the least, as if generosity is synonymous with ignorance, and restraint with weakness, when in fact, it often means the exact opposite, that those of us who watch from the sidelines, who quietly pick up the pieces, who nod and smile and write checks instead of arguments, do so not because we're blind, but because we're patient, because we choose peace over ego, and because we are storing every detail, every insult, every silent transaction in the vault of our memory, waiting not for revenge necessarily, but for the right moment to make the truth undeniable. That's the thing Dan never understood about me, or maybe never cared to see, that while he performed chaos in the spotlight, I watched from the wings, taking notes, never forgetting the parts he hoped would be lost in the noise. It had been a full 2 weeks since Christmas dinner, 2 weeks since I'd cut the cord and stopped financing the version of their life they loved to flaunt. And in that time, the temperature of the family had dropped dramatically, like someone had turned off the heat in a house that used to pretend it was warm. I didn't go to Sunday dinner. I didn't respond to texts asking me to talk things through. And while the silence on my end remained deliberate, the noise from Dan's life had begun to rise to a fever pitch. I heard through a mutual friend, because these things always make their rounds in small towns like ours, that Tina had started asking questions, that their finances were tighter than she realized, that there were arguments about where the money was going, about why things suddenly felt so fragile when just weeks earlier everything had looked, at least from the outside, effortlessly stable. But what Tina didn't know, what she had never been told, because Dan preferred to play the hero in his own story, even when someone else was footing the bill, was that this particular collapse had been inevitable long before I stopped writing checks. And what Dan had forgotten, or maybe arrogantly assumed I'd never use against him, was that I had the kind of receipt that didn't just call his character into question, but exposed it entirely. Because 2 years ago, during a particularly convincing stretch of financial hardship, when Dan had come to me with a pained expression and a story full of vague language about overdue bills and just a temporary situation, I had wired him $10,000 without asking for proof, without requiring a contract, and without expecting a repayment plan, because at the time, I still believed that doing the right thing meant trusting that family wouldn't exploit your kindness. He'd said all the right things, promised it would be used for essentials, for getting them through the next few months, and because I was exhausted, and because I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time he meant it, I sent the money that afternoon, straight from my savings, no questions asked. But what he didn't know, what he hadn't counted on, was that I'd later learn, purely by accident, exactly where that money had gone. I had been at the bank updating my own account details when I saw a familiar name pop up on a screen across the teller's desk. Dan Madden requesting a wire transfer from his account to an out-of-state marina, just 2 weeks after I'd given him that loan. And while I didn't ask then, didn't confront him in the moment, a quick online search later confirmed everything. The transaction had been used as a down payment on a used boat, one he'd later show off in family group texts as a gift from a friend who owed him a favor. I never said a word, not at the time. I chalked it up to a lesson in boundaries, tucked the memory into the back of my mind, and told myself that maybe the boat had been a desperate attempt to give his boys something fun, something bright in a life full of struggle. I gave him grace, more than he ever deserved, because that's what I had always done. But when he stood up at Christmas, mocking my life, my divorce, my silence, when he laughed and told the room there was no seat for failures, I knew I wasn't going to carry that secret any longer, not out of vengeance, but because the truth, when denied for too long, becomes poison. So I found the emails, yes, the ones he sent thanking me for saving him, outlining the vague reasons he needed help, and I pulled the bank statements, not because I wanted to shame him, but because I wanted to remind him that accountability is not cruelty and silence is not amnesia. I bundled them together in a single quiet message and forwarded them not to Dan, but to Tina, with a single line at the top. You deserve to know the full story. I didn't hear from her for 2 days, and during that time, I questioned everything. Wondered if I'd overstepped, if I had crossed the line between self-preservation and pettiness, if maybe I should have let it stay buried. But on the third night, my phone rang at nearly midnight, Tina's name glowing in the dark like a ghost I'd summoned. Her voice was quiet, not angry, not accusatory, just tired, the kind of tired that comes from having the truth sink in slowly, like water rising in a room you thought was safe. He lied about everything, she said, and then silence. No follow-up, no explosion, just those 4 words, heavy and sharp and more final than any fight could have been. I asked if she was okay, and she laughed, not a joyful laugh, but the kind that comes from finally seeing clearly. He told me you cut us off because you were jealous, she said, that you resented us for being a real family. I didn't say anything in response, because I didn't need to. She knew now, she understood. And whether she stayed with him or not, whether she forgave him or chose to leave, that was her decision. My role wasn't to fix it anymore. My role was finished. The next day, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a letter, not to Dan, not to Tina, but to myself. A reminder, a declaration, one I folded and tucked inside a drawer I used to keep only for bills and household files. It said, people will only treat you like a failure for so long as you let them believe you don't remember the truth. Because I remembered. And now, so did she. It's a peculiar thing, the way silence settles after the truth has been unleashed. Not the anxious, restless silence that precedes a storm. Not the dense, suspicious quiet that lingers during a lie. But a slower, heavier stillness that descends only after everything that once buzzed with urgency and deception has finally been dragged into the light, exposed, and stripped of all its performance. It's a silence that doesn't demand attention, but rather waits, calmly and without apology, for people to reckon with what they've built and what they've broken. And in that waiting space, where accusations fall flat and manipulation loses its grip, there is an unexpected kind of peace, the kind that comes not from vindication, but from finally ceasing to carry a weight that was never yours to begin with. In the days that followed the revelation, the messages grew fewer and the voices quieter, not because the family understood me any better, but because they had been forced, if only temporarily, to face the version of events they could no longer deny or bury beneath laughter and tradition. Dan didn't reach out immediately, which surprised me, though not for long. He was always the type to go silent when he lost control, not because he was introspective, but because retreating allowed him to craft the next version of the story, one where he could still be the victim, still salvage some sliver of moral high ground, still paint me as the unstable, bitter sister who'd lashed out for reasons too personal and too petty to be taken seriously. I knew this because I had spent most of my adult life cleaning up the emotional debris of his denial, smoothing over family drama with money and tact and silence, a quiet operator behind the scenes of a man who mistook volume for strength. But this time, there was nothing to clean, nothing to fix, no cracks to seal with polite conversation or passive-aggressive placation. The damage wasn't mine. The lie had been his. And now he had to sit with it. When his message finally came, 5 days after Tina had called, 4 days after our mother stopped speaking to me, and 3 days after I'd spoken to my financial advisor about moving a portion of my assets into a trust with no family access, it arrived not as a call or a text, but as a letter, hand-delivered in a thin, slightly crumpled envelope with my name scrawled across the front in that rushed, angular handwriting I remembered from high school notebooks and hastily written apology notes left on the kitchen counter after a fight. It was 3 pages long, written in a tone that swung wildly between anger and desperation, the kind of writing that betrayed just how much control he'd lost and how badly he wanted it back. Not because he missed me, but because he missed what I gave him. Stability, silence, and the ability to pretend his life was exactly what he said it was. The letter began, predictably, with blame. He accused me of betrayal, of turning Tina against him, of airing private matters in a way that felt cruel and calculated. He insisted that I hadn't just punished him, but had punished the kids, had inserted myself into a marriage that wasn't perfect but didn't need your help to survive. He wrote about the irreparable damage I had done, about the financial mess he was now left to explain, about the humiliation of having his secrets laid bare, not just to his wife, but to everyone who had always seen him as the successful one, the one who held things together while I floated through life with nothing but opinions and judgment. But beneath the bluster, buried under his defensiveness and barely masked rage, there was something else, fear, real, raw, palpable fear. Because without my money, without my silence, without the veneer of a sibling who always covered for him, Dan didn't know who he was anymore. He had built his identity not on who he was, but on what he could extract from others while convincing them it was mutual. And now that I had withdrawn from that arrangement, the scaffolding he relied on had collapsed. Near the end of the letter, his tone shifted slightly, softening, though not quite becoming apologetic. "You've made your point," he wrote. "I hope it was worth it." As if the truth was a game, and my refusal to keep supporting his illusion was some kind of theatrical move on a chessboard instead of a final act of survival from a woman who'd finally had enough. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer with the letter I had written to myself only a week earlier, the one that reminded me I was not a failure simply because others had said so, the one that told me I had a right to stop being a character in someone else's story and start being the author of my own. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I didn't call him back. Instead, I made tea, sat on my back porch wrapped in a blanket, and stared out into the quiet evening, not thinking about the past or replaying conversations, but simply sitting in the calm that follows when you've told the truth and decided not to apologize for it anymore. That week, I went back to my therapist for the first time in nearly a year, not because I was in crisis, but because I wanted to process what it meant to redefine relationships that had always been defined for me. We talked about boundaries, about how it's often not the initial act of setting them that causes the most pain, but the fallout, the way people recoil from your no, as if it were a betrayal, the way love that was once unconditional reveals itself to be deeply transactional. I told her I didn't feel guilty, but I did feel hollow, like I'd finally exited a room I'd been locked in for years, only to realize how quiet the outside world really is. She told me that was normal, that silence is often the first sound of healing. Over the next few days, I made small but meaningful changes. I took long walks without my phone. I deleted the family group chat. I started a savings account labeled For Joy and transferred $50 into it just to feel what it was like to give to myself first. I pulled out my dusty notebook and wrote the beginnings of an essay about invisibility, what it means to be seen only when you're needed, what it costs to be generous in a world that never stops asking, what it feels like when the people closest to you define your value by your utility. And for the first time in years, I started to write not out of obligation, but because it felt good, because it was mine. I don't know if Dan and I will ever speak again. I don't know if Tina will stay or leave, or if my mother will ever understand that loyalty without truth is not love, but submission. I don't know what the family gatherings will look like next year, or if I'll be invited to any at all. What I do know is that for the first time in my life, I'm not waiting for their approval. I'm not measuring my worth by how quietly I can carry the weight of other people's mistakes. I'm not accepting the label of failure from a man who built his life on borrowed credit and borrowed loyalty. And maybe I was never meant to sit at their table, at least not the one where mockery replaces affection and money replaces gratitude. Maybe I was always meant to build a new table entirely, one that doesn't require payment for admission or silence in exchange for belonging. Because if being a failure means refusing to fund my own mistreatment, then I'll wear it like a crown. And if choosing myself is what finally broke the spell, then I'm not sorry I cast it.